Well, I think it's a fascinating thing because I think almost all scientists are experiencing this phenomenon of convergence, and it's having an enormous impact on people. It's a kind of upheaval in a way for the science community. And I view it as arising really from the fact that we're in this period where we've made a lot of progress in individual disciplines. And if you think about it, I think this is something many people would appreciate, that in the early days of science, there really was only one science. And the truth is, that's a fact. There is only one science. It's a way of thinking about the world, and all different ways of doing it are connected with each other very deeply, fundamentally. And so, in a sense, it's interesting to think about what made people think about divergence in the first place. And that was simply to make progress, because the problems were hard, and by breaking them down into disciplines where there were systematic ways of thinking, one could achieve a certain level of progress. And science has matured in that respect enormously. So today it is the case that we have convergence simply because the tools we get from each discipline are so sophisticated, and the problems we want to tackle are complex, that it becomes a matter, as a practicing scientist, of simply competitive advantage to be involved with convergence and to take the best of all the tools that are available from the disciplines and combine them in order to answer a complicated problem. It's a fascinating period. Yeah, so, I find in my own personal research that I'm engaged in with my coworkers, students and postdocs that are working with me and other scientists that I collaborate with, that this issue of convergence is really impacting my own personal research very much. And I try always to pick research problems that will have a certain combination of characteristics. I want them to try to work on problems that have a core that's very fundamental, that impacts the disciplines that I come out of, but also to touch upon the large problems that society is facing. So in my case, my research concerns the science of nanocrystals, very small crystals, and we approach that science from many different disciplines. For example, there's the very fundamental physics of the behavior of a very small crystal, which is very different than that of a large bulk piece of matter. But there's also the chemistry of how to make such an object and to deal with it in that respect. And then there's many, many aspects of it that turn out to be deeply connected with biology, which we can get into in a moment. So at least those three core disciplines are all playing a huge role in the science in my group in studying these materials of nanocrystals. But then beyond that, for us, as we start to gain control and learn about these materials and know how to use them and so on, for me it also is very important to try to think about how could this science impact society. So we try to select areas of application of our materials and pursue those because of their impacts potentially in the long term on society. And so in our case, we're really looking at impacts that would relate to energy and environment topics, and impacts that would relate to health and biology, fundamental biology. And those are the areas that we're excited about in my group. So we try to understand how nanocrystals could be used in energy and environment areas, and how they could be used for topics that would be important for the health sciences. Those are the two areas. So fundamental studies of nanocrystals, and then how those impact those two core areas that are so tied up with the future. Well, the crystals themselves are kind of a topic that begs for convergence, partly because of the fact that they have a need to be created, so the chemistry shows up, but their basic properties are really tied up with the physics, and most of many of the ways in which we deploy them really are inspired by biology. So the disciplines connect, but I think one thing to really try to appreciate, especially somebody who's not inside science today, there are a couple of things that I just think are really worth trying to bring to people's attention. One of them is what a research group tends to look like today. And so if you go to a research group in a variety of areas in nanoscience, certainly, you'll find inside it an incredibly interesting combination. First of all, the people's backgrounds will vary enormously. There will be people in my research group, there are people who have previous degrees, bachelor's or PhD degrees, in all of these disciplines of physics, electrical engineering, material science, chemistry, biology, and they're all coexisting inside this research group, having come with very, very different backgrounds. And they are all talking to each other every day, and a lot of the talking is to learn each other's language because the languages that they've been trained in are so distinct. And so there's a kind of constant shuffling and learning from each other that goes on inside a research group like that. And it's fascinating to see that, because when I was a student, it was not that way. Typically, a research group would have really been focused within one discipline, and maybe there'd be an occasional person who had drifted in from another one because they had some funny journey in their life, but it wasn't part of the kind of most common part of the science culture. Whereas today, I would say it's almost the most ordinary thing that any research group would have a diversity of scientific backgrounds having come into it. And I have my own background, which enables me to think about problems in certain ways. But I'm very attracted always when I have somebody wanting to work with me who comes from a very different background from my own. I look at that and say, wow, that's an opportunity. This is a way in which I could learn to deploy another language in my research. The other thing that I just think it's really worth mentioning, because it doesn't get talked about quite enough, is just how international in scope that a research group tends to be these days. I think it was 2 World Cups ago of soccer. My research group had members in it from 7 out of the 8 quarterfinal countries. So, for that month they didn't get a lot of work done. But it's fascinating to see how these have become a modern research group, and it could be in the United States or it could be in countries, many countries across the world. A modern research group today at the cutting edge of science really draws talent globally. And so convergence, for me, it has this character of the different disciplines, but also of the different cultures coming together. And it's very inspiring to think about people, particularly lots of young people, coming together to work on the hardest problems in an atmosphere that's, open, respectful, different disciplines and experiences teaching each other. So that's what convergence sort of means to me as a scientist today. It's an incredible cultural phenomenon as well as a technical and scientific one. Yeah. Well, it's very interesting to think about in this period of convergence, what are some of the things that enable it to happen and what are some of the barriers? And also, if convergence is working, what are the pluses and minuses? Is everything good as a result of convergence? Do we lose some things as a course of that, and so on? And I think that's a fascinating question. To me, actually, one of the most interesting things about this period of convergence as a scientist is the struggle it poses to the scientific mind of an individual. And I mean that in the sense that to be a successful scientist, you have to find a way to really think deeply about things. And that's why people broke things down into smaller pieces that could, and to methodologies and approaches that could be, systematically developed. And the individual scientific disciplines tend to have cultures that go with them and ways of thinking. And they're deep. They really were developed over hundreds of years in ways that have been very impactful. So now when we're in this convergence period, I think the biggest challenge, particularly to a younger scientist, is to learn to speak multiple languages. It's hard to do that. It's not an easy thing to do. But actually, for them even, one of the biggest challenges is to be sure that they learn at least 2 languages in great depth. Because it's possible to become shallow and to just learn everything in a sort of superficial way. Oh, I can use a little bit of electrical engineering and a tiny bit of biology and just a smidgen of physics, and it turns out, you know, it's possible for that to be to generate something that's not as deep as what had been happening previously. And there are aspects of culture today in science that are interesting in that respect, that relate to other trends in society. For example, some decades ago, people would write longer research papers. And when you would read a paper, it would really go in great depth into thinking a problem through. Today, there's a tendency to report on a small set of results as a rapid blip of communication, you know, a short thing saying this is something that we achieved. But it's rather unusual to see a publication that kind of goes into the depth of thinking that underlies that result. And so, you know, to me, that's a part of the convergence, the strengths and the weaknesses. The strengths are that it allows us to tackle much harder problems than we could have before. But the weakness is that the core disciplines can kind of get hollowed out a little bit, and people don't remember how to do that sort of deeper type of thinking that also is important. And so this is why the convergence-divergence kind of dynamic is one that remains fascinating. It's not something where there's a sudden shift and everything becomes convergence and it's over. One has to also try to think hard about the core disciplines. And in my own research into the nanocrystals, I try very hard periodically, and I try to work with my students to encourage them in this direction, to occasionally think about how they could make a contribution that really would look like something very recognizable within a core discipline that they might be trained in, like physics or chemistry, a specific one, and try to go into it a little bit more in depth. And it's an interesting dynamic because it's a little bit going against the style of the moment. But I think that there's a kind of a dialectic that goes on between these two that's very interesting and very fascinating. And so to me, that would be probably the biggest issue that I would see out there, is how do you retain depth in an era of convergence, because convergence means necessarily having to use so many diverse approaches, and yet each one you have to be versed in fairly deeply. Right. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I think in today's moment, the trend for sure is to bring multiple disciplines together. And it's working. I think almost any scientist today, if you talk to them after a little bit, will tell you that they experience personally this incredible moment where the number of discoveries just feels like it's exploding. And it's partly because more people have come into science, but it's also because of this combination of disciplines really works. And so it means that in a sense, maybe there was a period of time when we were held back from that by cultural and disciplinary barriers. And now that those have kind of fallen, a lot of progress is being made quickly. So it's exciting. But then, you know, I sometimes do worry about this. Who will actually make those more fundamental discoveries within the core disciplines that everything relies upon? And that's why I think it's just important to remind ourselves to periodically go back in and try to think about our own disciplines and to respect them greatly. There's a tendency, particularly I would say maybe in universities, to have the disciplines today almost be viewed a little bit as barriers. You know, people are really too locked into their discipline, and we have to favor the interdisciplinary and so on. And I think this is a fascinating topic. I think when one wants to keep this moment of convergence healthy, but part of that means making sure the disciplines themselves also have a core that remains strong. And I do think we'll see some oscillation there over time, where some people will go back in and kind of focus more deeply, because after all, scientists are always seeking competitive edge. And you could extrapolate out to a situation where 15 or 20 years from now, perhaps convergence will have reached such a point where there'll be competitive edge to a scientist who decides to specialize more and become more divergent instead of convergent, because by doing that, they'll have an ability to have an impact that is distinct from what's present more commonly. That could happen. It would be fascinating. Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I think that it's a very important period of time in terms of the relationship between science and society in general. Science, as it's become more and more successful and impactful, has really changed the life of almost everybody on the planet. And as we've reached this period also where that's brought about prosperity and more, and it's brought about an increase in population, and the human footprint has become large enough now that it actually is changing the planet. And so for the first time, I think we have a period where how science develops is intimately tied up with what the future of a global humanity will be like. So that's fascinating. And to me, it means that scientists are going to be in more and more demand, but the results of their work are going to be impacting society very dramatically. And it's important for scientists to think about those things and to become part of the conversation with people who think in disciplined ways outside of strictly scientific topics, but think about issues that relate to how society functions. And so I think that's a fascinating convergence, actually, to my mind, is also going to be showing up between science and between the social sciences in more and more ways. So I think that's a big trend that we'll see in the coming years. Yeah. Sure. Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the issues of energy and environment are the ones which come up most directly. And there what we see, of course, is that human activity is changing the planet. And at the same time, the populations around the world that are impoverished are doing everything possible to raise themselves up and to reach a better standard of living. And as they access energy in a significant way, then their impacts on the environment will increase even more. So that's an example where clearly we have a global challenge that's just fascinating. It's a very large challenge. It's one that can be handled, I'm pretty confident, but it's one that really will pose deep technical challenges, but at the same time, deep societal ones as well. It's not just a technical problem. It has dimensions that transcend that. And I think that's a really exciting moment for science to be engaged in things like that. I'll give you another example of where I see these types of convergence issues being fascinating, and this is a topic which has fascinated me over the last few years. I'm a novice in it, relatively speaking, but I think it's fascinating. And that is the convergence that's going on between nanoscience and neuroscience. We have this moment in time now where we've learned a lot about certain aspects of brains, of human brains, and brains of animals at a certain level, but our understanding of it is definitely very incomplete. And I think there's an enormous opportunity to advance our understanding in that area in the coming decades. And some of that will happen because of the advances that have taken place in nanoscience, which enable us to perform measurements on small scales, rapidly, in parallel, large numbers of measurements, and so on. So I could imagine that it's possible, and with many colleagues we've been discussing this in the last couple of years, how it should really be possible to perform very large numbers of measurements inside a brain, animal brain, a fly brain, and a worm brain, and so on. And ultimately to be able to integrate those measurements into a deeper understanding of how the brain is really working. And I think that's an incredible opportunity. But when you think about it, it also touches upon topics of what is cognition and the other topics that neuroscience naturally just brings into any discussion that transcends strictly scientific topics, but start to enter into topics that are ones that relate also to the nature of thought and what the neurological disorders are, many aspects of it that are convergent in that sense outside of strictly science. Because we have a scientific conversion onto a problem that is really important, but you can also see how that has implications well beyond those simple technical issues. Yeah.